5 years ago, you know, when more people cared and there was more criticism because it was President Bush and criticism had kind of percolated through globally and even domestically that something was deeply wrong, and there was a lot of criticism. President Bush, you know, was releasing prisoners. There wasn't the questions that we have now of, you know, starting from a point of view of it seems to be very, very deeply unsafe to even release anyone, you know, and the most massive case has to be made for the release of anybody. So we've ended up with this extraordinary situation where cleared prisoners are held, which is, I keep repeating, is so deeply unacceptable. But, you know, it was almost easy for prisoners to be released 5 years ago. We're not fundamentally talking about different people. You know, because around half of the cleared prisoners were cleared for release under President Bush, but he didn't get round to releasing them at the time, because many of them were Yemenis, and because this Yemeni issue has persistently been there. If your nationality is Saudi, it became at a certain point quite easy to get out of Guantanamo because the United States has a much closer relationship with Saudi Arabia, and negotiations were undertaken on that basis. So the Yemenis have always suffered. But, you know, it's really not acceptable, is it, that we can all agree there are a few dozen Yemenis that everyone who has studied their cases has said, look, these appear to be quite dangerous people, so we're going to have to be very careful with these, and hopefully we can put most of them on trial. For the cleared prisoners to end up being the same, being treated the same, that's just wrong. So we need to be able to make the case that people who are pretty insignificant really are, that's it. Don't worry about it. Let's not crank up the hysteria and the fear, because that's what's been happening. Since President Obama made his announcement to close Guantanamo and then didn't follow up and hasn't taken the lead, we've had people filling that vacuum whose mission is one of stirring up fear, and that mostly, I think, has been for their own personal political motives, not because they genuinely believe it.
And no one's in charge.
You know, one of the, I don't know if I think it seemed like I mentioned this last year, so it's been that long, but I was driving and I heard on NPR, I turned on the radio and there was a story about somebody being in prison in Cuba, and it was unfair, and I thought it was going to be a story, I thought it was going to be a story about Guantanamo, and it was about Alan Gross, who's an American citizen in prison in Cuba. And our government is really good about, if it's an Alan Gross, or Amir Hikmati was the American that the Iranians were going to put on trial in Iran, or the hikers that were picked up, or the people that were North Korea. You know, we're really good about, you know, how dare you hold an American citizen, and insisting that, you know, it's, you know, a violation of the rule of law and you can't do this. Yet we've got people that have spent more than a decade in prison because of their citizenship, you know, that we have said did not commit a crime. They're not here to be punished. They're here because of their citizenship. And I would imagine the public, you know, the right-wing, you know, airbags that are on the radio and television would be pitching a fit if Americans were being held because of their citizenship year after year after year in another country. But, you know, we're supposed to be, you know, American exceptionalism, but which apparently creates an exception when we do things that we condemn others for doing, which is just fundamentally wrong.
This gentleman here. Could you wait for the microphone just a second?
I'm Eric Lewis. I litigated the case on behalf of the British detainees, civil torture and religious abuse case. I'd like to ask you about next year, with the withdrawal of all troops and the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. What is your view on the basis under the law of war for continuing to hold without detention or trial the people who are left at Guantanamo?
And just to add to that, so it is potentially an opportunity for Congress to revisit the authorization for the use of military force, which most Congress people, when they voted, probably didn't think was going to last for 12, 13 years. Is there any chance that there might be a modified authorization once combat troops leave Afghanistan?
Well, I think there is. The question is, as Rick is pointing out, there's really no authorization to hold people as Mo and Andy said, you really can arrest people for criminal charge, or in a combat situation, you could take troops up out and hold them till the end of the battle. And the purpose is not to punishment, but to keep them out of the battle. If the battle is over, I would say Congress would have no right to even authorize their holding. That's going to be an argument. And the argument for most of the people being held is that we are in a combat. Now, the government will argue they were really picked up in the continuing war on terror. I think, this is technical. I don't think the Hamdi case, which authorizes detention, authorizes holding people in a continual war on terror. They say it's really, at least that case was decided on picking, it was an American citizen, but picking somebody up in the context of the particular combat that's going on. So, and this is confusing for people, but if the war is over, you can't hold people as, purported prisoners of war.
It was encouraging. I think Jay Johnson, who is the general counsel for the Department of Defense, who unfortunately is leaving to go back into private practice, who, in my opinion, is a person I've got a lot of respect for. He gave a talk, I think at Oxford, somewhere in England recently, where he didn't go into great detail on this, but suggested the same thing, that that this war is winding down. And when it does, the legal justification that we've used to detain these people likely goes away when the war winds down.
Wouldn't it also take away the legal justification for drone strikes outside a war zone in terms of out of a convention? I mean,
well, that's another issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what is the answer?
I'll let somebody else answer it, because I tried, as we did last year, to try to keep the drones away from this issue. I mean, I'm terribly troubled by it. I think there are good arguments you can't do it, but one isn't contingent on the other. I want to get Guantanamo closed.
But we have two lawyers here. The authorization for the use of military force, is that the underlying legal rationale for the use of drone strikes in places like Yemen?
No.
I think I think you have to keep in mind there are two drone programs. I
Right.
think for the military program and the kill list that goes with that program, that yes, it's based on, we're at war, and combatants can kill the enemy, even if they're unlawful, deemed unlawful enemy combatants. I think it's much harder to make that argument on the CIA. I mean, like you said, it's the authorization for the use of military force.
Maybe can I rephrase it? I'm not asking if it's completely legally kosher in your own minds. I'm asking, is that the legal basis under which the administration, both whether it's Bush or Obama, authorizes the use of CIA drone strikes?
We don't know for sure because they won't tell us. But at least from what they have said, because in the ACLU lawsuit trying to get the legal justification, the government's argument is that the government has never officially acknowledged that we have a drone program.
Even the president's given interviews now, so it's...
Well, but they're saying they've never officially, even though they talk about it and they crow about the success of the, they said the government has never officially acknowledged that we have a drone program. But the argument in like Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan has been that we have the consent of the government to hunt down bad guys and kill them because it benefits us and them as well. So I don't know that the law of war is the rationale, legal rationale for those strikes.
There's a distinction. I think the government can make a strong argument based on the commander-in-chief's power under the Constitution that he has right to take action to protect the United States. It's a slippery slope, and you see how far it goes. And that's independent of the authorization for the use of military force. The authorization of the passage by Congress of something authorizing him makes his power stronger. As Justice Jackson said, when you have Congress and the President together, it's hard to do it. But I think they can argue under the Constitution. One of the differences is the right to detain people is always something that's been covered. I mean, it's aside from going and killing them. The right to detain people has always been something more in the judicial branch and covered by judicial review and the law. So you may have more right to use force than you do to detain people, the government.
But I think with the AUMF or the constitutional authority, those are great shields, for a domestic criminal prosecution. But the Constitution or the AUMF can create international law. And when we're killing people in Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia or other foreign countries, the Constitution and whatever acts of Congress, have been passed are irrelevant.
I would just say that, if I could, just that if the United States really does pull out of Afghanistan, and that brings to an end the principle that you can have these wartime detentions. The problem that we run up against, which has been avoided for 11 years, is that people detained in wartime haven't been detained as people detained in wartime should be detained. We have sidestepped completely the Geneva Conventions and the fact that people are supposed to be held until the end of hostilities. Now, in a Geneva Convention sense, the withdrawal of US troops would definitely signify that.
Combat troops, yeah.
Yeah, but the problem is that, when the Supreme Court decisions were made, the judges actually kind of echoed the Geneva Conventions by saying the AUMF also applies until the end of hostilities, setting up a kind of parallel Geneva Conventions detention provision that's based on the AUMF. The AUMF, I don't think, will be given up lightly by people with power and responsibility for it. That's the problem. That's part of the reasons we've seen an NDAA, the NDAA provisions to try and expand what the AUMF covers so that it doesn't narrowly cover just Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but it can be expanded to whoever the hell the president decides is the enemy. It's very troubling. We will be put in a position where we can argue that we've reached the end, but I think the last 11 years have shown that there's a lot of institutional push for this war to be endless.
This gentleman over here.